Okay, capitalism and socialism. This one is super interesting to me. I've been caring about this communism question, like all of us. Everyone here at least remembers the Cold War. We can't say that every week, depending on.
Same world.
Yeah, and some people they don't remember. But it was fascinating to me when I started hearing stories coming out of the Soviet Union in the 80s about just the mind control, the thought police type of approach where we'll tell you what you're to believe. And I couldn't fathom a government doing that. So I started looking into it and went on my first mission trip in 1992. Tried to go in 91 when it was still the Soviet Union and it didn't work out logistically. So I was there less than a year after the Soviet Union had ended. And so I was still going through stores where there was nothing on the shelves. I mean, it was very eye-opening and encouraging in that this should have failed. I mean, these people were miserable. They were super happy to start talking to Westerners finally after all those years not being able to. They were asking us tons of questions about life in the U.S. and we were asking them questions about their lives. It was great. So 3 other times since then, my wife and I have gone back together. Since we got married, we did 3 mission trips, and we've been involved in Slavic churches and all sorts of hosting an orphan from Ukraine a couple of times. We just really, I don't know, it's one of those things where you can't explain why you have a heart for something, but you do. And what gets me is that this book here messed over so many people, and it's like, it's not that much. I mean, the Communist Manifesto is thin, it's not very deep, it's just a lot of rhetoric, a lot of we're angry and it's all their fault, so kill them and take their stuff, and with the promise of a future utopia. So that has always fascinated me, so that's what's kept me interested, especially as this country starts flirting with it, or again flirts with it. I mean, the West has been flirting with socialism all along. It started as a Western movement. Karl Marx, of course, was in Germany, so England had a strong socialist movement, and so on. So I'll start off with a little bit of just, I assume everyone here knows. If it was a bigger class, I would probably go on a little bit longer about this, but you remember learning in school, you would say fascism on one side, and capitalism, and then socialism, and communism. You remember that continuum? And I always thought that was odd because socialism is just the next logical step is communism. The fascism and capitalism have nothing to do with each other. I was like, what? When they explained it to me, I thought, okay, you're already trying to convince me of something that's not natural. You're trying to cram in your beliefs into this lesson. But real quickly, if you don't know what capitalism is, then we have other issues, right? So we don't want to go over that. We're going to start with socialism. It's an economic system in which private property is abolished and the means of production are owned by the state. Merriam-Webster says basically the same thing: a way of organizing society in which major industries are owned and controlled by the government rather than by individual people and companies. So you have various levels of socialists. In America here you have a Bernie Sanders who says, well, I don't want all private property to be taken over by the state and redistributed, just certain big businesses. I want, whatever. He wants the Ma Bells and everything to be socialized. That has to do with the utilities and transportation, and he would probably put banking in there. I think he did put banking. Education, for sure. Well, it's kind of already socialized, public schools, but he would probably have done it. Hillary did say she would do away with any kind of private school, homeschool movement. All that would be done away with because socialism, the state school cannot compete with a free market because they have to measure up. They have to have accountability, and that doesn't work in socialism. Socialism, if you looked at the last election and the rallies that Bernie had, Bernie Sanders had a lot more people coming to his rallies than Hillary did. People were more excited about him. Now, if you looked at the age group of these people, they were either people who clearly were at Woodstock and they still are suffering the damages from it, or they were young, people in their 18 to 24, the early millennials or younger millennials. You didn't see a lot of people that looked like someone who was trying in life, who had to balance their own checkbook at the end of each pay cycle and had to live with the consequences if they didn't. It was idealists or people who are still trying to be idealists from the 60s. Socialism sounds good until you define it. There was a lot of surveys that were done around that time because pollsters were like, why is socialism? Why is Bernie Sanders getting all the excitement on the left? That seems surprising to them because it's usually the more centrist candidate like Hillary that would get more excitement. But it wasn't. He was getting all of the excitement. So they would start interviewing people and, what do you think is the best system? They would say socialism. I think the number was 1 out of 6 young people said socialism is the right way, and then 1 out of 3 had some other question when they asked. It was 1 out of 3. So 30% has some affinity for socialism. Until, hey man, we're already done.
Yep, I missed it.
We already just said socialism's bad. Let's go home. So, but when you define socialism, so you would say things like, okay, so you think like Google and Starbucks ought to be nationalized and it should be run like the post office or the DMV. Well, no, I want to get my latte and I want to, okay, well that's what socialism is. Well, I don't like that. So you start like actually putting some meat to the belief and saying, this is how it's going to affect your life. That all they liked about it, all they wanted out of it was, well, I want free school, I want free healthcare, I want free, whatever I can get. But they didn't look at the other side of it, which was the people who provide the good services wouldn't be able to do it anymore. So the takeaway for us as Christians who are trying to convince our neighbors, people like that maybe, is get them to define what they mean. Maybe a couple weeks, or which time was it ago? But a few times ago, we talked about the tactics that Greg Koukl teaches. Do you guys remember that name, Greg Koukl? I don't like repeating myself too much because I do it already enough. Greg Koukl, it's a book I recommend. I don't have it with me. It's just simply called Tactics. And it's a great, he doesn't deal as much with the actual arguments for Christianity or against other belief systems, but he gets into how do you, in a conversation, get to the point as quick as possible so you're not dancing around the issue or arguing about fringe things where you're getting right to the point. And the first thing he says to do, there are 4 questions that he uses to do that. The first one is, what do you mean by that? So if someone says, yeah, remember we talked about it, I can't remember which class it was.
Turek.
Yeah, well, Turek uses it all the time, definitely. They're buddies, and they train together. But someone says, hey, I believe in socialism. What do you mean by that, the word socialism? And usually you could stop the conversation right there, or at least end the debate. Well, I believe that, schools should be free. Okay, do you think that all schools should be property of the state? Do you think all students are property of the state? Do you think all? You start asking them questions, they would quickly, most of them would say, no, I don't believe that. Okay, well, you're not really a socialist. You just think certain industries should be socialized. The next question he says is, let's see, what do you mean by that? How did you come to that belief? So you can ask them, so what do you mean by that? And they tell you, well, I think the state should own everything. So where did you get that from? And then probably from that book right there, or this is the Communist Manifesto. So that's what we're talking about here.
Well, I think the brain is a sponge. They've been taught that through the whole educational system.
And they probably couldn't identify it.
Kindergarten up through, wherever they are.
Definitely through the bachelor's degree. There was an interesting thing that a recent guest speaker at our church said that the surveys show that the highest number of atheists that you find in college level is in the junior colleges. When you get to the prestigious universities like Harvard and Yale and the Ivy League, you have a much smaller percentage of those people that identify themselves as atheists. So when you see numbers that say professors are mostly atheists, they're averaging it all together. So basically what he was saying is, yeah, the less educated you are, the less prestigious, in other words, you haven't thought about it that much, and you're just in a safe little junior college environment where you're not going to get challenged by another professor who studied it deeper. Yeah, you can be an atheist, and and you can get away with it, but you're not going to be comfortable if you're going to be held to, your feet are going to be held to the fire. So I thought that was interesting because I've always heard that that most of them are. Communism is a system in which goods are owned owned in common and are available to all as needed. Okay. You can see how socialism and communism are a matter of degree. Unlike other belief systems, economic systems, I mean, that are just completely separate. Like we said, fascism and capitalism, just different way of organizing society. They're both different from socialism. But communism is just socialism once it's finished its job. So oftentimes, when I was preparing for this, I was reading a lot of Jay Richards and other sites that were dealing with the massive amount of young people who are flirting with communism again. But they're not doing it in the name of communism, because communism failed, right? Communism has all these bad, negative connotations involved. So they don't want to call themselves communists, Marxists, but you ask them what they believe, and that's what they believe. But communism is just the goal of the socialist state. The USSR, of course, Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, not communist republics. They understood that communism is where we're headed. They were headed. But we're going to go deeper into that in a minute. So, Karl Marx. That's again, he wrote this and Das Kapital and some other smaller books. Those are his two big ones. Okay, Karl Marx on God and religion. This is what I brought up in I Don't Have Enough Faith to Be an Atheist. So this book says, hey Eric, hey guys. This book says there's no God. Religion is the opium of the masses. That's early on in here. But then he starts talking about how capitalism is immoral. It's unethical because it's exploiting the workers. The capitalists, the owners of the factories, are exploiting the labor of the workers, and these workers aren't getting their fair share of the profits. So the question is, Carl, if God doesn't exist, like you say at the beginning, then how is it unethical for anybody to treat anyone else in any way they want? If there's no moral standard, if there is no created thing that we're supposed to be, type of human, telos we call it, or nature, then the Bolsheviks, the proletariat are not being exploited by the bourgeois. They're just, like the gazelle getting eaten by the lion. What's the big deal? It's not immoral. It's not unethical. So no Christians were around saying that. No theists. And I was disappointed when I started looking into that this is an obvious hole in his whole project, and nobody was trying to exploit it. Come on in, your dad's here.
Where?
Back there.
Oh.
Pick one of them. We got lots to choose from. So you've heard the famous line that religion is the opium of the masses. That's the bumper sticker. I was watching The Office as a family. We were watching it. Really funny show, but written by atheists. At least some of them were, and they used that line in there, taking a drag from the opium of the masses at the wedding that they went to. So that basically religion is there to get people to sort of dumb themselves down so they'll blindly follow whatever they're told by the state or the priests. They'll just do it because God's going to get them. If they don't listen to him, God's going to get them. So that's why he called it the opium of the masses. Human beings. What is a human being under communism? Well, if there's no God, and there's no spiritual aspect to reality, then a human being is obviously not a spiritual being. A human being is a physical being only. So he's a strict materialist. That's the philosophy that the material universe is all there is. So therefore, human beings become things like cogs in a machine. You have parts that work together to do what you want them to do. Those are physical parts. Well, human beings are just physical. So you start plugging people in where you need them to be in order to make a machine work. Well, which machine is it? Economics in this case. How do you keep people eating enough food to be able to survive and have a roof over their heads without anybody having more of one of those things than anybody else? That's the machine he's trying to create. World and history, you've heard of dialectic materialism. The dialectic was a philosophy from Hegel that I'm still confused why anybody would even think it's a good philosophy. And I've talked to our philosophy professors, and Hegel kind of like came on the scene and left. If it wasn't for Karl Marx, nobody would even know who Thomas Hegel was. He believed that all of thought, all of reality actually was a synthesis between the thesis and the antithesis. So he would say like rich, poor, and then you bring them together and you have a new thesis, or God, atheism, bring them together. And he thought all of human history, all of human thought was that. So Karl Marx and John Engel, they put it together into economics. That's where they said the classless society would emerge when you do away with the rich and the poor, bring them together, and you'll have the classless society. That's how he viewed history. He would look back and reinterpret all of Western history as this inevitable march from a monarchy to communism, utopia. And then ethics, like I already said, if there's no God, then you can treat human beings however you want. Dr. Lamb was here 3 or 4 weeks ago, if you remember, he said the beginning of all ethics is the answer to the question, who or what is a human being? And once you've answered that question one way or another, that decides how you can treat them. If they are just material, like Mark said, then yeah, you can do whatever you want with them. And basically, the only way they could not do what you say is if they're stronger than you. So might makes right. So here, you do this labor for me. No, I don't want to do that labor for you. I'm going to make you do it. No, you're not. I'm stronger than you. Well, I have a gun. Oh, okay, I'll do it. You know, so you start getting into might makes right, and that's that was what he came up with. If there is no God, the ethic is, well, we as revolutionaries have to be able to forcefully take these things from the bourgeois.
So, Eric, question for you. So, over the last, obviously, number of decades, it seems like it's pretty proven it's a failed experiment, right? It's come about more recently how obvious it is since the fall of the USSR.
You would think.
That. So, if it's so heavy from the top down, you know, the government very oppressing and telling folks what they can and can't do, what property they can and can't have, and all of that, how come there isn't more of a rebellion, kind of an uprising from some of the countries that are left that are communist? I mean, you think about the leaders are fewer and the masses are so many. You think that they would just hit a point, especially in today's day and age with communication, TV, internet, they see what
they realize they don't have to take it because they see the information from other countries.
But I'm just thinking they want that, right? They might look to France or America or something and say,
yeah, which is why the Iron Curtain was put up. They had to keep the information out. And when I was in Russia in '92, they would tell me stories that they were told about America. And once, you know, under Gorbachev, when he started to lessen that police state, he still was a communist and he still believed in all of that. But he thought, well, we can't maintain this kind of oppression. We got to give them some freedom to show them that we're here for them. Well, then they started getting books and some movies and other things, and they realized, I thought America was like everybody lived in a box on the street. They thought all of America looked like Detroit, where I'm from. No, most of America is doing quite well. And that was the beginning of the end of the Soviet Union, when that lie about how capitalism has made people miserable, and all they saw were smiles on people's faces. So that's the only way, is to keep information controlled. If you read the book 1984, has anybody ever read that?
I think it was required in high school.
In some schools, ours it wasn't. I didn't read it till later, and wow, it was intense, wasn't it? And the thought police, of course, and the main character, I can't remember his name, but his job was to go through news headlines and edit them according to whatever the party was saying was the news that week or day. I mean, it was just a mindless job of constant propaganda. It didn't even matter. It was just to keep people under control. That's all that it was there for. So anyway, that would be the answer, I think, is that, well, that's how it used to be. They didn't let them see it. But today, Russians, in Cambodia, I saw this when I was looking at the Killing Field story. Some cultures, they just have a fatalistic view. The Russians are like that. Culturally, they're very much like, oh, that's our lot in life, to just suffer, and you know, we're we're meant to suffer because we're Russians. It's called the Russian way. And so when communists started to oppress them, they're like, all right, that's the next one. The czars just did it, now the communists are. So that's why in that country they didn't rise up. Plus, they were getting shot when they did, or sent off to the gulags. In Cambodia, it was similar. They killed everybody who had them, self-respect, or, hey, you're not going to tell me what to do. I have a, degree, or I'm, this. Well, we'll kill you. And then all that was left were the peasants, because they were the ones doing the killing. And so that's why in Cambodia. So I think it's psychological warfare, largely. I don't know how Venezuelans, they don't call it communism anymore. So it's socialism. That's all it is. It's socialism. Because we know communism failed. But socialism, let's give it another shot. That's kind of the message. And so the question, utopia, of course, is this world in which everybody gets all the food, shelter, and love that they're required. And everything is good. Nothing stands between you and your dreams and your aspirations or your good family. See you, man. Tell him that, how dare him.
I will.
He's got to do training. He's like, why do they have to do it tonight on a Wednesday? This is Wednesday. That's because we're the only class meeting, I think. So utopia is this fictitious, well, I won't say that, I'm loading it. I think it's fictitious, that it can't happen. It's not possible outside of the Garden of Eden to have utopia. So it's interesting when you read different Christians on this question, like Norm Geisler actually says that utopia is a worthwhile goal. Hey, we should pursue it, but know that we're never going to get there because all men have fallen. So because of sin, we're never ever going to have utopia. But I actually think that even this pursuit of this classless, just get what you need without having to work for it because it's all provided for you. I don't think that's a worthwhile goal because we're meant to, as human beings, have purposeful work. We're meant to have vocation and we're not supposed to have toil. That was the curse, because Adam was given work to do. You're supposed to tend to the garden. It wasn't hard like it is now, but he had to go and pick his food. I don't know if he had to store it or what, probably not, but he was given meaningful work to do. But at the fall and the curse, what did God say? I'm going to add to that, only through the sweat of your brow will you be able to feed yourself now. So this toil that's introduced. So that's why I'm against socialism and communism all the way down to, I don't think it's even an admirable goal. I think it hurts or stands in the way between a person and what they're supposed to be. Even if they're in the Garden of Eden, they're supposed to be doing meaningful activity. And the idea of utopia stands in the way of that. So I think it should be resisted even for that. Anyone else have any other takes on that? I know not every Christian agrees on whether utopia is worthwhile. You ever thought about utopia?
I think most people probably long for it, but our hope is of heaven, of course, so I sort of just kind of squash the thought of like, I'm trying to achieve it here. But I don't fault people for wanting it, because it's obviously it's the opposite of the pain and suffering that you see, and everything's just sort of taken care of.
I think it's I think it's heaven that we want, or Eden, one of the two. But so what we really want is what we were created to have, and that's the question. Is I think utopia has this sort of you just sit and your stomach gets filled without you having to lift up your hand, and whereas the garden didn't seem like that. It was joyful and purposeful, and we would have had careers. There's some I forget the name of the books, but it's fun sometimes to think about what life would have been if Adam and Eve hadn't sinned. Like what things were present. So the family was around, right? You had kids, you had marriage, and I was complaining last month about how I just don't like it, Lord, that the kids are growing up and this stinks. I don't like it. And I said, you know what? But that would be true in Adam and Eve. Right? If they had lived, their kids would have grown up and left and made their own family. I said, that's not good, God. So I was talking about that with one of my friends who's a professor and more holy than me. He goes, no, but think about it. Your kids grow up, and you're in the same shape you were in your 20s. So you're, all the playing you did with your kid, get on my back, let's wrestle and all that. When you have your grandkids, you're in that exact same shape. And so you're enjoying them, you're mentally acute, you're physically, in shape. And he said, so that's how it could be just, forever. You're enjoying every generation the exact same way you did that first generation. I said, okay, I can see that. So speculating about what Eden would have been like, I think is helpful. Larry Crabb, you guys ever hear of Larry Crabb? I think we've talked about him before. You've heard his name before? A Christian psychologist. I love his writings. But he wrote, you're never going to get any better, any healthier emotionally until you really let what it means to live in a fallen world get to you. Because what we don't like about in our relationships or in our life is a result of the fall. And so you're supposed to not enjoy that. You're supposed to say, wait a second, you're not supposed to treat me that way. Yeah, you're right, you're not supposed to. Then he says, of course, direct your anger and your resentment and all that where it really is you're mad at God because God let this happen in our fallen thinking is what we're saying. So that stuck to me, that, I'm supposed to not like this. I stub my toe, it hurts. I should think bad things, or at least think this shouldn't be. So, any other thoughts about Utopia? I don't want to assume before moving on. Okay. These are two books. I know let's pass them around. This is cool. 10 books that screwed up the world. Isn't that cool? Written by a Christian, and he goes through, of course, Marx. What else did you have here? Darwin, of course. Nietzsche, Sanger, Hitler, Freud, Kinsey. You guys know Kinsey from the 50s? Oh, man. He's the guy who, it was called the Sexual Habits of the American Male. Sexual Behavior of the Human Male. Does that ring a bell? The title at least? Yeah. He supposedly had all this data, and then it turned out later that his data was majorly skewed. His sample were ex-convicts. And so he was the one who had been in prison and had been, taken advantage of by the other prisoners. And he thought that, he postulated that is normal sexuality. And so he came out of the book, that book, in the 50s, and it brought about the 1960s, the sexual revolution. So that's one of them in here, but Mein Kampf, of course, and others. But I definitely recommend this book, especially the chapter on Marx. So when he says that Marx screwed up the world, think about this. 65 million people died in the Republic of China. And that's to date. I mean, I presume they're not doing it as much as they were during the revolution. Maybe they are, but the numbers that we have is 65 million. 20 million people in the Soviet Union. 2 million in Cambodia, 2 million in North Korea so far. He's definitely still killing people. Ethiopia, Afghanistan, Eastern Bloc, Vietnam, Latin America, of course the Venezuela, that's still going on, and Cuba, for that matter. And then 10,000 deaths were, they were communists, but they weren't a government. They were trying to bring about socialism or communism. So, come on in. Yeah, hey.
Hello, we were joining you.
No autographs.
Yeah, I was expecting
These
some.
are the actresses from the forthcoming Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe production here at First Baptist Indian Trail. Oh, they're allowed to come. I hope it's not a secret. We want people to come.
No, we don't.
Oh, we don't? Oh, okay. I play Father Christmas.
Oh,
So
yes. He's amazing.
it's been, what's my line? Okay, so we are talking about, actually 85, about 100 million people murdered because of a belief system, because of this book. I mean, obviously this book just wrote down what people were thinking. But because of the ideas in this book, 100 million people. I saw a t-shirt once back during the Tea Party movement. These t-shirts started popping up. And I love this one. It said, communism's only killed 100 million people. Let's give it another shot. Why not? We just haven't figured it out yet, how to work it. That's a serious indictment against socialism / communism. Now, the thing that is so, I'll go through this before I make the statement. Okay, one of those, I'm just going to zoom into one of them. The Russian famine of 21-22. Does anybody know, of course you've heard of Herbert Hoover, not the vacuum guy, but the president. Before he was the president, he was, I forget what the title was, but he worked for the federal government, basically FEMA. He was a disaster relief czar. He knew how to organize things and go in when there was a earthquake or a Katrina or something like that, and knew how to get things well. He actually ultimately went in along with some other organizations and he saved the Russians. So what happened here is they had just come off of war, World War I, the Bolshevik Revolution. It was like any war will do, it devastated the populace. But these people were farmers. They still knew how to take care of themselves, right? They could plant potatoes, and then the potato bush would come up. They knew how to save the seeds, and this is that kind of society. They're not new to this. The Bolsheviks, though, said that's not right that you have enough food to eat, but that guy over there down the way, his farm, his family is starving. That's not right. So they were implying the principles of distribution and centralized control of the means of production. And they went in there and they literally stole all of the equipment, the fertilizer, the seeds. They just took everything that you need to feed yourself and to feed your animals so you can feed yourself. And then they said, okay, now we're going to redistribute it so that everybody has enough. And of course they just biffed it, and then they didn't do a good job, and they couldn't get it to the right place at the right time. People were starving before they delivered the seed when you weren't supposed to be planting the seed, because there are people who live in Moscow, they didn't understand you can only plant for a short period of time before it's too late to harvest it. So they were just making mistakes left and right, but they did it with an obstinate. Lenin actually said he was mad at these farmers because as far as he was concerned, they should have been providing him the food he needed to keep fighting the wars that he wanted to fight to win over the country. So as a result, it's estimated, there's debate between 2 million and 10 million, but a conservative number is 5 million people died because of starvation, literally just starved themselves to death. When the West came in and started to provide relief, there was signs of cannibalism, that people had resorted to eating. We hope they're dead, hopefully not their neighbors who were still breathing, but it was bad. It got very, very bad. The point here to say, yeah, well, look at all the people who died in capitalism because America dropped the bomb. Look at all the people that died there. Well, there's nothing about fighting a war that is unique to capitalism. Every society that's organized protects itself from its neighbors, and that's called war when there's an aggression. So there's nothing about war that's unique to capitalism. Redistribution of the means of production and redistribution of wealth, that's the definition of socialism. So in this case here, it's because they were socialist that 5 million people starved to death and some resorted to cannibalism. See the difference between there? People can all day long talk about the evils of Western society, this and that. Okay, fine. We can, slavery or, what are the ones that are always out there? In the Middle Ages, the Inquisition, the Spanish Inquisition, the Crusades. Just start throwing out all these things that the West has done that were evil. Well, there's nothing about those that are unique to the West, where this is. Now, in Cambodia, the killing fields, this blew me away because I didn't realize, I always thought this was all happening in the 50s, the Mao Zedong rebellion, the Bolsheviks in the teens and the 20s. This was the 1970s. They ended in 1979, this Cambodian uprising. You've heard of the Killing Fields. It was a movie that was made in 1984 depicting it because some of the people, the Westerners, some journalists escaped and they started reporting what had happened. There was Pol Pot was the leader, but the name of his party was the Khmer Rouge. So they specifically said, we want to socially engineer our society. So we're going to tell what teachers to go where, what professors to do what, engineers to do this. We're going to tell everybody what they're to do. So we're going to do social engineering. Sound familiar? Some of the things we hear in our debates and politics here. But some people weren't playing along. I don't want to be an engineer. I want to be a doctor. I want to be, no, I want to do this. So they shot him. And when the West came in, that's a picture of one of the killing fields. Millions of people were just shot in the head, slit their throats. Oh, you're not gonna do what we say. You're done. And it was just indiscriminate. And they called them the killing fields because they just had mass graves. And when the West came in to dig this up and verify it, yeah, there were mass graves. What we saw in Bosnia, nothing compared to this. Bosnia was bad. The mass graves that we found, that was ethnic cleansing. But this was cleansing along ideological lines, which is in some ways scarier, because ethnic cleansing, this is a crass way to say it, eventually you run out of people that you're trying to cleanse, and you're done. But if it's an idea, you have an endless supply of people to slaughter, because ideas, people can always be convinced of something that you disagree with. They specifically looked for intellectuals. City residents were disproportionately murdered. People who are ethnic minorities, like Vietnamese in their country. Religious leaders, of course. You gotta get rid of the Christians. And in this case, there were some Buddhists that were gotten rid of, because Christians are gonna teach their people to care for each other. And that undermines socialism, because you need the state to care for you, not your neighbor. So they killed them. So, let me pass this around. Another one I recommend: Money, Greed, and God. Jay Richards is the guy that I quoted a lot last time around about libertarianism. There's a chapter in there actually on libertarianism, Ayn Rand, really interesting. But he goes through why capitalism is the most in line with reality, number one, but also the most humanitarian, takes care of the most people. And so it's a defense of why Christians ought to be free market capitalists, but not libertarians. Now, we already went through that. There are a lot of good Christians who call themselves libertarians. We're not talking about the party, Libertarian Party. We're talking about the philosophy, libertarian philosophy, economic philosophy. That's why a big difference. Okay, before I go into the scripture, any questions, disagreements? Why are we talking about this? Anything like that? It's interesting to me, this crowd here, I think it was, you said it, someone said it about, it was you, I think, about why are we even debating this anymore? Communism fell. We all saw it didn't work. And that's true amongst Gen Xers and older. But the millennials and beneath age, they were born way after. They have no memory, like we do, of Tiananmen Square. They have no memory of the fall of the Berlin Wall. Brooke and I went to the Ronald Reagan Library, California. I was moved. Did you think I was goofy? Because I was so because there's a section of the Berlin Wall there, and I was just like, oh my, because you go right up and touch it. You're like, to me that was huge. Like this is it. This is the actual wall that was built as a prison to its own citizens. Like, no, you don't have a right to leave and seek a better life for yourself. We know better. We're going to trap you in here and make you be communist. That's the Iron Curtain, right? So, yeah, we all know that it failed, and it was horrific when we started seeing all the stories about what happened. But the younger generation doesn't remember it. Of course, they weren't born yet, and their education doesn't tell them. There's a disproportionate number of favorable to communism or socialism professors in the academy. So they're getting the rosy story. The media plays along, talks about, well, communism was bad, but socialism, taking care of the poor, keeping those bad capitalists down from oppressing their workers, and, Bernie Madoff and others that are, they shouldn't be able to make all that money. It's the capitalists that caused the crash in 2008, right? That's what we were told. Actually, it wasn't. It was government intervention that caused it. Fannie and Freddie caused it. It's socialism that hurt these countries so bad in 2008, not capitalism. Okay, so that's just, in some ways, look, that's just math. There's not enough. If you were to redistribute every dollar, liquidate everybody's wealth in America, I think the number was every individual would get like $1,500 or something like that. It's not enough. the rich aren't rich enough to give everybody what they think they're going to get. So in one way you can say this is just math, it's not going to work. And then you add in their human nature that I'm not going to work harder if you're telling me at the end of a hard day's work, right next to this bum who's sitting on his butt, we're both going to get the same pay. I'm not going to work harder. My friends in Russia, they said the joke was, we pretend to work, our bosses pretend to pay us. That was the economy in Russia, and in the Soviet Union. These are Russians saying it, but it doesn't produce ingenuity, right? So that should be enough to kill the communist dream and the social experiment. But there is a large number of Christians who are in that same age group who are pro-socialism. You ever hear of the liberation theology or the social gospel? You've heard of, well, it's not social gospel, I'm sorry, liberation theology. And I don't mean black liberation theology of modern, but liberation theology of the late 1800s, where pastors were actually teaching, Karl Marx has it right. He's wrong about the atheism thing, but that's how God wants us to take care of the poor. And it's immoral for people to make money and not give it all away, is what they were teaching. So they merged Christianity with, as a big resurgence to that. So what scripture do they go to? One of them is the sheep and the goats. Jesus says, for I was hungry and you gave me something to eat. I was thirsty and you gave me something to drink. I was a stranger and you took me in. I was naked and you clothed me. I was sick and you took care of me. I was in prison and you visited me. And the righteous will answer him, Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, and thirsty and give you something to drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or without clothes and clothe you? When did we see you sick or in prison and visit you? And Jesus says, I tell you, whatever you did for one of the least of these brothers and sisters of mine, you did for me. Okay? How you take care of the poor and the suffering, it's a big deal to Jesus, right? So when they point to this and they say, so anybody who says that you should cancel programs that redistribute wealth, then you're violating that scripture. Because the wealth that you're taking from the rich and giving to them, I'm not talking about, programs that you pay into, like Social Security or Medicare. I'm talking about just flat out taxing and then giving it to these people over here. They say that's the way to answer this passage. What would you say to them? First of all, has anyone ever heard that before?
Say that last part.
That the way to obey Jesus here is to vote socialist policies so that you can clothe the naked, feed the hungry, all the things he says here.
I never heard of this.
You never heard that?
No.
Maybe I spent too much time on the college campus in Campus Crusade and stuff afterwards. That's the argument, that you are disobeying the central commands of Scripture if you disagree with socialist policies. Because Bernie Sanders is saying, I want to give to the poor. I want to equalize, level playing field. You ever hear the 99% and the 1%ers are hoarding all the wealth, all that. Christians were saying that proportionally. I didn't see I find the exact numbers, but the percentage of Christian young people who were saying that is roughly the same as the percentage of non-Christian young people that were saying that. We constantly are reflecting the culture instead of changing the culture. What about this passage in Acts? Now, all the believers, this is okay, after Pentecost, Christians are just starting the church here, and people are starting to notice the difference between Christians and non-Christians. They were together and held all things in common. They sold their possessions and property and distributed the proceeds to all, as had any had need. Every day they devoted themselves to meeting together in the temple. That's all worship. They ate food with each other. Okay, praising God. And every day the Lord added to their numbers. Okay. Sold their possessions, redistributed according to their need. Karl Marx said, from each according to his ability, to each according to his need. That was one of the axioms of socialism, of communism. Isn't that what the scripture's saying right there? This is what they point to.
Well, I think all of this is voluntary. You do that because of the love of Christ. It has nothing to do with what the government has to do with. We do that because it's the right thing to do as Christians.
And this is not,
And we don't necessarily have to sell everything we own, but the verses you had up prior to that, that's what I was really speaking to, more than this.
you guys remember the very next passage? I think Ananias and Sapphira. Remember that story? That's actually, this is the setting up of that story. Jen, you're the one that said it? You're the one that said the name?
Ananias and Sapphira.
You want to say the story? Like, what was that?
Wasn't that when they were holding back some of their money, to give to, I don't know if it was to the church or to whatever, but they were taking a collection and they said that they had collected it and gave it all, but they hadn't given a portion. Which in and of itself, I think was,
Some land.
Yeah.
They sold something and said they gave all the proceeds, but didn't give all of it.
and I think the issue wasn't that they didn't give it all, was that they said they gave it all, but they didn't give it all.
Exactly what it says.
They lied.
It says you didn't lie to people, you lied to God. You lied to the Holy Spirit. That's why they were put to death. God killed them. It was the only time. It was sort of stands out, doesn't it? In the book of Acts. Sounds very Old Testament. Someone being struck dead.
Sounds like Lot's wife or something.
Yeah, exactly right. So that's the answer. Number one, this was voluntary. And number two, in that passage, they even say, I think it's Peter that's addressing them, look, that property was yours to do with as you wanted. That money was yours to do with as you wanted. But that's not why you're being put to death or you're being punished. You didn't know they were going to die yet. But it's because you lied to the Holy Spirit. He goes out of his way to say, no, you didn't have to do this. You freely did it, and you just want to look as good as everybody else who was giving 100% of their proceeds. But the other thing too, another, there's it doesn't say it really, okay, as any had need. There's another English translation that makes it more apparent. It says from time to time, as anyone had need, people would sell possessions and give to the needy among them. So it wasn't like all right, everyone pile every asset you have into the pot and we're going to redistribute it. It was, let's do life together. Oh my gosh, somebody has need here. Can anybody help? I mean, that happens today, right? Preacher Mike knows who to call when there's a great need in the church because he knows who, has told him that I'd like to help a little bit extra whenever I can. God's blessed me. This happens today. It's not socialism. And lastly, there's one other really important difference. So it's voluntary, and then, like you said, it was not all of their possessions, and it was, what's the third thing?
The motivation is the love of Christ that's in us.
And who is redistributing the assets
The
here?
believers.
The church, not the government.
Yeah.
That's a big thing that they miss when they say, well, the government should do it. Really, that's the last entity that we should be saying should take all of our possessions and dole it out. So at best, this is the church that is, having a little bit more of a leadership role in people's lives. Now, this is also in Acts 2. Pentecost had just happened. This whole new covenant, this whole new era is brand new. Christians were like trying to figure a lot out still at that point. Because, now why do I say that? Is that like me trying to, I don't like that passage, so I'm going to ignore it by calling it early Christianity. Well, it had gotten so bad that by 2 Thessalonians, this is many decades later, Paul says, for you yourselves know how you should imitate us. We, meaning the apostles, he and his friends like Luke, were not idle, we weren't lazy. We did not eat anyone's food without paying for it. Instead, we labored, we toiled. What was he called? He's a tent maker. He had a job. We labored and toiled, working day and night so that you wouldn't be burdened. We wouldn't be a burden to any of you. It's not that we don't have the right to support. So he's saying the church does have a right. Preacher Mike has a right to get paid a salary based on our tithes and gifts. There's nothing wrong with that, he's saying. But he didn't do it to the Thessalonians because he said, I don't want to even go there. I want you guys to know that I can earn it myself. Want to be a good example. Okay, in fact, when we were with you, this is what we commanded you. If anyone isn't willing to work, he should not eat. Now, can you imagine? I mean, he says that guy's able-bodied and he's sitting around. Let him starve. He'll either die or he'll get off his butt and he'll go do something. Now, it doesn't mean, because there's other passages about the widows and the orphans where it says if you don't take care of their financial needs, then you're worse than a pagan. So there are the weak amongst us that you take care of. But it's saying the exact opposite of what we see communist countries produce, which is not necessarily laziness, it's more of a calculation. I'm not going to work harder if my lot in life is exactly the same, no matter how hard I work. Forget it. I'll do the minimal amount to exist. That's all I'm interested in. So, yeah, the Bible is very strong by the time. So it kind of feels here like a lot of people misread Acts 2, even in the first generation of Christianity. Oh, we're supposed to sit around and you're supposed to be taken care of because that's the Christian way, and produce laziness.
You also see that in cults as well. So cults, like a cult compound, and they'll kind of all merge together their assets and support each other.
Yep, it's a commune.
We used to belong to a church down in Florida.
I thought you were going to say we used to belong to a cult.
We used to belong to.
It was awesome.
Almost.
And at this church, they splintered off. I think it was a Baptist church, right?
It was a non-denominational,
Oh,
but it
I
had a
think it was
Baptist
Baptist.
leaning.
So there was a splinter group that went off, and they formed a house church, and this whole group came together, and they followed that Acts 2 thing. It was a big deal, and it was eventually it dissolved, but it impacted a lot of people in the church because they put a lot of their own money into the pot, so to speak, to be shared, and didn't have a lot of say necessarily how it was going to get spent. So the other thing too, I wonder with the Thessalonians, I wonder if they were preoccupied, some of these people, just standing around waiting for the Lord to return. Because I know that was addressed heavy.
That was the context here, right?
The context, right? So he's like, stop just waiting and go do something.
Don't pretend you're being spiritual by looking into the clouds.
Right.
Yeah, or even don't pretend you're being spiritual by just reading your Bible all the time. It is a spiritual act of worship to have a vocation. Yeah, my wife grew up in exactly that kind of church, and it was they were cool. I've met them, but it went wrong. You've heard of the stories, Bert. These people, like, they started telling, like, her dad he is strong-willed enough, just enough to be helpful, because they were saying, okay, everyone sell your land and all move into this 1 square mile in Ann Arbor, Michigan. Ann Arbor's a really liberal area, so really liberal. But if we all just joined together and just basically they wanted to make a commune, and it was very much into the hippie. They were grow your own herbs and all natural, and it was combining hippie lifestyle with this communistic view of church. And my wife's dad was like, no, I'm not selling my property and moving in with a bunch of smelly people who don't shower. He was like, no, I'm not going to do that. So they kind of ostracized him, and that helped them get out of that group. So a lot of spiritual abuse. Even if it's not a cult, I think it's probably borderline cult, but even if it's not, it's definitely spiritual abuse, even if they're doctrinally sound. Yeah, it's pretty messed up. I was going to go somewhere with that when I was saying that, but I can't remember. It's something that I just thought of as I was talking about the Ann Arbor, Michigan one. So, okay, this was a really short one, yeah, because that is the end. I was hoping there would be somebody here tonight that was a little bit more favorable to socialism and be like, well, wait a second, but we have too many wise people in here. We're like, no, we been there, done that, we've watched it, there's just no. So the question is, this is because the whole point of this series we've done is that, in a few weeks, really, we're in the middle of political season. Every other commercial is going to be something against Mark Harris or against Republicans in general, against those big bad conservatives because they don't love the poor and whatever else. We know that it comes every 2 years. So as it comes, how do we argue for free markets? How do we argue against a socialist or a obviously communist, but this idea of utopia? Well, what's wrong with Bernie Sanders, wanting that? Shouldn't you want to do all the things Bernie says to do too? So what would you say to a Christian who is saying it's wrong for the rich to not do their fair share? What are some of the phrases that you hear? Pay their fair share is what I hear a lot. The rich ought to pay their fair share. The majority of the wealth is in the top 3%. You hear that. What do they say, 90-some%?
So Eric, are these Christians saying then that the government should do this? Is that their belief?
They usually, the ones I've talked to, don't want to say that. So when you ask them, you're like, you mean the government? You trust the government to do this instead of the church? I haven't met anyone who has told me that, yeah, I think the government's better positioned to. I did have one guy that I worked with at Youth Commission International who this is who he is. And he said that, look, it's, the government is just in a better position to do it. They're, because of they have the channels to get the money out. And I said, well, what about all the waste? I mean, you give $1 to the government in taxes, and they put it towards a social program, like 20 cents on that dollar, if that actually feeds somebody or gives them a blanket or a shelter. Yeah, but you're talking about billions of dollars. Some waste is okay because you're still getting more money to the. So you mean be a bad steward of your money and collective money? You're okay with that, just as long as the net result you're happy with. So that's what I've heard.
I would say look at ancient Israel too as a model. So if we look at the nation of Israel and how the government was run over different hundreds of years, you never really saw an example of socialism at work there. You saw kind of risk reward. You had farmers that were extremely wealthy and owned thousands of miles of land, and those that were very poor. But you never saw calling for the temple to somehow, it was obviously it was a little bit more of a theocracy. I mean, it's not really, but close, right?
Right. It was the only government that we know God said, this is my government.
Right.
Not full theocracy.
And there was nothing that I can see that was written in the law on how they were supposed to redistribute everybody's wealth. I mean, there's taxing and there's tithing and those things, but beyond that. So if that's the only model we have to go by as far as the government stood up that we think is respectable, and we honor that from God being a part of that.
Mm-hmm.
I would just tell that person, let's start there. Let's think about why wouldn't God have done it over how many thousands of years would that have been?
Israel,
1,500?
1,500, I think,
Yeah.
if you count the judges to.
So over 1,500 years, if it was never instituted there to be to that level, why do we think we're going to change that now? That would be one angle.
Yeah. It's also interesting that in ancient Israel, checks and balances are instituted. Like that's more supportive of our system.
I heard an interesting commentary on the news the other day about this, and it might have been like a Juan Williams, like on a contributor. He's coming from the liberal side, right? But they're starting to make the case that the millennials and they're starting their desire. You start to see this rising desire for socialism, isn't because they want socialism as we understand it. They have a new vision of what socialism is. They want socialism and capitalism. So they still want to be able to go and create a company and innovate and make $1 million. But at a lower level of that, there's some things they still want to redistribute some of the wealth. It's not all of it. So it's strange because it's kind of encroaching, very slowly. It's creeping in. But I think the average millennial that would say, I'm going to go and vote, even if it's a Christian person who says they want to do it if they're young, they might do it not really knowing what socialism is.
Right.
And so if you ask them, I don't think they can tell you that it has any roots here. They're just thinking we need healthcare paid for everybody. Right? They'll start with some of the basic services.
Yeah. The homeless should.
But if you take it all the way to its, to its end point, they would probably say, no, I'm not ready for that part yet. And so therefore, they don't really consider it socialism.
Yeah, and there's some truth to that. A policy can be socialist, but it doesn't mean that it's full-blown socialism. Of course, we would argue that is it a slippery slope? How much of the government taking private property are you okay with? And but socialists don't like to talk about how it gets paid for. They just talk about, this, we gotta take care of people. And of course, Matthew 24, we're like, yeah, you do. But we do as Christians. If the church was doing its job better, across the board, the government would be out of a job. They wouldn't need to be feeding as many people and all of that. So that's one indictment on us, is we need to stay engaged. And some of the more liberal denominations today started out with good intentions, like United Methodists and those groups that are really good about taking care of the community around them. But you get into those congregations, you start talking to them. My mom lives right next door to one, our sister lives down in Georgia. They do all kinds of great stuff. But then you talk to them, and it's like God is almost a means to an end. It went from, I love God, so I love my neighbor, and I'm going to take care of my neighbor, to God's a useful thing for me to talk about so that I can accomplish what I really care about, which is charity. And see, that's like totally backwards. Like, no, it's because of our love for God that we love each other and we love our neighbor as ourselves. But it's the reason why Jesus said that the most important commandment is love God, and then the second is just as important, love your neighbor. It's got to be in that order, first and second. And also, yeah, I worked in capitalism, in advertising capitalism in Detroit, and so I worked with people who were voting blocks for liberal politicians. But the ones I was talking about here are Christians, so morally they were but we agreed on everything. They sold advertising, and so their customers' ability to pay for advertising, therefore give us a commission check, depended on them having favorable tax policies. So I would ask them, like, do you think that your customers should be taxed more because they're the big bad corporations, or should they have more of their own money to be able to invest back in the company? Oh, I think they should have more of their own money. Okay, and then I started asking them questions, and I told them, everything you just said there, you're like a right-wing Republican, pig dog, whatever you want to call that branch. You agree with them, so why are you voting opposite that? I think it's because people don't think through, like, I know these things are true, put it together, what does that mean I'm committed to then as a citizen? They didn't want to admit it. In her case, there's one case, her pastor was running in the primaries as a Republican, and he was a pastor of a mega church in the inner city. And so it was really interesting for a lot of them, because they're like, our pastor's, running as the devil? How can that be? So it was just a really good opportunity to talk about these things. But yeah, they just don't want to say, when the check comes, who's paying? And it's always someone else. They don't want their taxes to go up. They want this nebulous 3%, whoever those people are, just someone else, that's all.
Something else I hear, I've got some, our company is based out of Ireland, so we have a lot of people who fly over from like the UK and Ireland, and those guys just love to talk and brag about how great like the EU is. If it was, some didn't want to split from the EU if they're more in the, in England. If it's Ireland, they're mad at England. But all together, they're all in alignment that they love socialism, and they are just absolutely blown away that we in America don't get why it's so awesome, and that we're almost like Neanderthals, right? We're just way behind in the dark ages. We'll get there eventually and understand that what they're doing is the right way. But they really look down on us politically. Just they think of us as being crippled intellectually when it comes to that. When you look at the global map of how the percentages fall, in terms of number of countries, not in terms of population, right, humans, but number of countries, is socialism, I assume, is by far the most number on the map, right? Most countries,
some aspect of socialism.
Almost all countries are either socialist or communist, with us being one of the rare exceptions, right?
Yeah, we're definitely the most capitalist, that's for sure.
Right. What are some of the other ones that you would put sort of similar to America?
I used to think Australia, but this last time around I heard some things where, because I've always heard they have a lot of free enterprise entrepreneurs down there. What's the other one? It used to be also the Eastern Bloc, but I think because they got freedom in the 90s and they were all excited about, like I heard stories from the Eastern Europeans. I worked for Volkswagen for a summer, and they told us stories about how the Eastern Europeans would look at their Western friends and say, like, why are you like all pro-socialism. We just got out of that. Like, you want to go back to it, but that kind of seemed to die out. So they've been putting it back in. I think it's just too tempting. You know, free stuff. Okay.
If you don't have to think, just put all the decisions up there.
Yeah. The thing that's interesting about your Irish friends is you say, you know, something else that we don't have that the rest of the world has is we don't have a state religion. You know, all you countries in Europe, you have a state religion sponsored. Do you think we should all in America have one religion mandated by the state? No, I don't think that. Oh, okay. Well, then you don't want us to be just like you. You guys are so Neanderthal. You have a state church. Catch up with us eventually, and you realize that's not right. So they just pick things, but it doesn't answer the main question, which is it working? Yeah, you guys are all socialists, but Germany is incredibly industrious. They have a lot of socialist policies, right? But they treat their companies very much like go out there and get, make a better product, work hard. They don't act like socialists as a society usually. That's why they try taking over the world twice. But you look at the ones that are succeeding, they're acting like capitalists are supposed to act, even if they're giving lip service to socialism. So again, it gets back to, you can't just label it socialist and everybody in that country, if they're successful, then that means socialism works. No, the successful ones are probably the ones that aren't acting that way. Dr. Lamb, my boss, went to Oxford, and so when he was there, he was pastoring a church, and so there was a piano that needed tuning. And it was, you got in the phone book, wherever the equivalent of the Yellow Pages is over there. And he started calling up piano tuners, and he couldn't find one. And he finally got to talk to one and talked him into coming in. And he said, by the way, why wouldn't anyone take this job? I called like everybody. You're the only one who would come out and tune our piano. I don't get it. And he said, oh, it's simple. We are capped how much we can make because we're socialists. So if I could work more, but I'm taxed at such a high rate that I actually don't come home with any money because now my whole income is taxed at that higher percentage. So I know where that is, and I stop, and I'm not going to take any more jobs. And he said that's how everyone is saying. So if they get there in February, they're off the rest of the year. They're not going to work at all because they're not going to give up all their income just because they want to have a good work ethic. And he said, so that's socialism. Now that was before Margaret Thatcher. He was there in the 70s. So she changed. She was able to undo everything except the health care, pretty much everything. She brought it back. She and Reagan, they worked together. Us here, him here, and her there. It just kills innovation. It kills work ethic. People don't get things like pianos tuned or their lawn done or even food made. It's that they're farmers, let's say. So anyway, sounds like you guys all believe socialism's bad.